On April the 26th, 1986, at 1:23 in the morning, a safety test at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant went catastrophically wrong. Reactor number 4 exploded, sending a plume of radioactive graphite and fuel rods high into the night sky over Ukraine. To the world, this event is remembered as the worst nuclear accident in history, a tragedy of radiation sickness, evacuated cities, and a poisoned landscape. We think of it as an environmental disaster or a human health crisis. But there's another story about Chernobyl, a story that is rarely told, but is perhaps even more consequential. It is the story of money. It is the story of how a single explosion didn't just crack a reactor vessel, but cracked the financial spine of a superpower. Mikhail Gorbachev. The last leader of the Soviet Union famously wrote years later that the nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl, even more than my launch of Perestroika, was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Why would he say that? Why would a nuclear accident destroy a political empire? The answer lies in the ledger books of the Kremlin. The Chernobyl disaster was not just a tragedy, it was the most expensive accident in human history. It was an 18 billion ruble fire that burned through the Soviet budget at the exact moment the empire could least afford it. To understand the scale of this financial catastrophe, we have to look at the Soviet Union in 1986. It was a giant with feet of clay. The economy was stagnant. The factories were inefficient. The technology was lagging behind the West. The only thing keeping the Soviet economy afloat was oil. The high price of oil on the global market provided the hard currency needed to buy grain, feed the people, and fund the military. But in 1986, the price of oil crashed. Saudi Arabia flooded the market and the price per barrel plummeted from $30 to $10. Overnight, the Soviet Union lost nearly half of its export revenue. The treasury was bleeding, and then Chernobyl exploded. The immediate cost of the disaster was staggering. This wasn't just a matter of putting out a fire. It was a matter of mobilizing a nation for war. Within hours of the explosion, the Soviet leadership realized they were facing a situation that had no precedent. The reactor core was burning, exposed to the air spewing lethal radiation across Europe. To stop it, they couldn't just use local firefighters. They had to use the entire resources of the Soviet state. They mobilized the army. Thousands of military helicopters flew sortie after sortie over the burning reactor, dropping bags of sand, lead, and boron into the gaping hole. Each flight was incredibly expensive, not just in fuel, but in machinery. The radiation was so intense that the helicopters became contaminated after just a few flights. They had to be abandoned in vast graveyards of radioactive metal. Then came the evacuation. The city of Pripyat, home to 50,000 people, was evacuated in a single afternoon. Buses were requisitioned from all over Ukraine. But you cannot just move 50,000 people into a field. They need housing, they need food, they need clothes, they need jobs. The Soviet state had to build new cities from scratch to house the refugees. They built Slavodish, a new town for the power plant workers, costing hundreds of millions of rubles. They had to pay compensation to every family that lost their home, their furniture, their car. And this was just the beginning. The exclusion zone, a 30-kilometer radius around the plant, had to be fenced off and guarded forever. This meant abandoning hundreds of collective farms, factories, and villages. It was a massive write-off of productive assets. The land that had produced wheat and milk for the Soviet people was now poison. But the biggest cost was the liquidators. To clean up the mess, the Soviet Union drafted over 600,000 men. These were soldiers, miners, construction workers, and specialists from every corner of the empire. They were sent into the most dangerous place on Earth to shovel radioactive graphite off the roof to wash the streets and to build the sarcophagus, the massive concrete tomb over the reactor. These men had to be paid. And because the work was so dangerous, the state had to pay them triple or quadruple wages. They were promised free health care for life, early pensions, and priority housing. The bill for the liquidators was astronomical. It wasn't a one-time payment. It was a long-term liability that would drain the Soviet welfare budget for decades. In 1986 alone, the direct cost of the disaster was estimated at 4 billion rubles. By 1989, the total cost had swelled to over 18 billion rubles. To put that 18 billion rubles into perspective, that was roughly equal to the entire Soviet defense budget for a year. It was more than the state spent on healthcare for the entire population. It was a hole in the budget so large that it could not be filled. Because the oil revenue had collapsed, the Soviet Union didn't have the cash to pay for this. They couldn't tax their people more because the people were already poor. So they did the only thing they could do. They printed money. To pay the liquidators, to pay for the concrete, to pay for the new cities, the state bank churned out rubles. This injection of unbacked currency into the dying economy fueled the hyperinflation that would eventually tear the country apart. Chernobyl was a financial black hole. It sucked in resources, concrete, steel, labor, and money, and destroyed them. At a time when Gorbachev was desperately trying to modernize Soviet industry to buy new computers and machine tools, every spare ruble was being thrown into a radioactive pit in Ukraine just to contain the poison. The disaster forced the Soviet leadership to stop investing in the future and start paying for the past. It paralyzed the Perestroika reforms. How could you restructure the economy when you were fighting a nuclear war on your own territory? But the financial damage wasn't just about the cleanup costs. It was about the loss of energy. The Soviet nuclear program was the crown jewel of their energy strategy. They planned to build dozens of new reactors to power their industries and free up more oil and gas for export. Chernobyl stopped that dead in its tracks. The safety checks ordered after the disaster forced the temporary shutdown of other RBMK reactors across the USSR. The construction of new plants was halted. This led to power shortages. Factories in Ukraine and Belarus had to reduce production because there wasn't enough electricity. The industrial output of the Soviet Union dipped precisely when it needed to grow. Furthermore, the disaster destroyed the reputation of Soviet technology. Before 1986, the USSR exported nuclear technology to its allies. After Chernobyl, nobody wanted to buy a Soviet reactor. A key high-tech export industry evaporated overnight. The psychological impact on the budget was also profound. The Soviet system was built on the idea of the plan. The 5-year plan determined everything. Chernobyl destroyed the plan. You cannot plan for a nuclear explosion. The massive diversion of resources to Ukraine threw the entire intricate web of the Soviet supply chain into chaos. A factory in the Urals couldn't get parts because the trucks had been sent to Chernobyl. The construction site in Siberia stopped because the concrete had been diverted to the sarcophagus. The chaos rippled outward, creating shortages and bottlenecks that no central planner could fix. Chernobyl also exposed the lie of Soviet prosperity to its own people. To pay for the cleanup, the government had to cut subsidies elsewhere. The shops became emptier. The lines became longer. The social contract, the deal where the people accepted a lack of freedom in exchange for security, was broken. The state could no longer protect its people from invisible danger, and it could no longer feed them. By 1987, the Soviet Union was effectively fighting a war on two fronts: an economic war against falling oil prices and an environmental war against radiation. It didn't have the money to win either. The 18 billion ruble fire was burning down the house. And as the smoke cleared, it became obvious that the foundation of the empire, its financial stability, had been turned to ash. The radiation was invisible, but the red ink in the budget was plain to see for anyone in the Kremlin brave enough to look. While the fire at Chernobyl was extinguished within weeks, the financial fire it ignited raged for years. By 1988, the Soviet budget was in a state of terminal decline. The cleanup of the disaster had become a black hole that swallowed every ruble the state could scrape together. The sarcophagus, the massive concrete and steel tomb built to contain the radioactive reactor, was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a monument to expense. It required 400,000 cubic meters of concrete and 7,000 tons of metal. To build it in a high radiation zone, the Soviets had to use remote-controlled bulldozers and robots. But the radiation was so intense that the robots failed. Their circuits fried. So the Soviets used biorobots. Men. Thousands of soldiers were sent onto the roof of the reactor for shifts lasting only 90 seconds. They shoveled radioactive graphite into the pit and ran back. Each man could do this only once before receiving his lifetime dose of radiation. This meant the Soviet Union had to cycle through a massive workforce. 600,000 men were eventually involved in the liquidation. Each of them had to be transported, fed, housed, and clothed. And critically, each of them was removed from the productive economy. These men weren't just soldiers, they were factory workers, miners, engineers, and farmers. For months, they were not producing steel, coal, or wheat. They were digging trenches in a poisoned forest. The opportunity cost to the Soviet economy was incalculable. The labor force was being diverted from generating wealth to managing a disaster, and the costs didn't stop at the border of the exclusion zone. The radiation cloud had drifted north over Belarus and Russia. It contaminated vast swaths of agricultural land. The Soviet Union was already struggling to feed itself. It relied on importing grain from the West, paid for with oil money. But now, some of its most fertile farmland was radioactive. The milk from cows in the affected regions was poisoned. The crops had to be destroyed. The government faced a nightmare choice: feed the people radioactive food and risk a health crisis, or destroy the food and face famine. They chose a mix of both. They secretly mixed contaminated meat with clean meat to dilute the radiation to acceptable levels, a decision that saved money but betrayed the population. Simultaneously, they had to increase food imports. But with oil prices still low, they had no hard currency. So they borrowed. The Soviet external debt skyrocketed. In 1985, the USSR owed the West about $28 billion. By 1989, that number had nearly doubled to over $50 billion. They were borrowing money from their Cold War enemies just to buy bread, because their own fields were poisoned and their own treasury was empty. Chernobyl also destroyed the Soviet energy strategy. The USSR had planned to double its nuclear power capacity by the year 2000. They wanted to use nuclear power for domestic electricity so they could export all their oil and gas for profit. After Chernobyl, that plan was dead. The public fear of nuclear power was intense. Construction on new plants was halted. Existing plants were shut down for safety upgrades. This meant the Soviet Union had to burn more of its own oil and gas to keep the lights on at home, leaving less to sell abroad. The cash cow was being eaten by the energy crisis. But perhaps the most dangerous cost of Chernobyl was political. It destroyed the lie. For decades, the Soviet system relied on the control of information. The state was infallible. The technology was superior. The West was dangerous, but the USSR was safe. Chernobyl shattered that myth. For the first few days after the explosion, the government lied. They told the people nothing. They let children march in the May Day parades in Kiev while radioactive dust fell on their heads. When the truth finally came out, forced by Swedish scientists who detected the radiation, the Soviet people realized their government didn't care about them. The glasnost, openness policy that Gorbachev championed, was put to the ultimate test, and it revealed a state that was incompetent and deceitful. This loss of trust had a financial consequence. If you can't trust the government to tell you the truth about a nuclear cloud, why would you trust them with your money? The Soviet people stopped saving. They started hoarding goods. The rubles in their pockets felt less like money and more like lottery tickets that were about to expire. The velocity of money increased as people tried to spend their cash before it became worthless. This fueled the hidden inflation that was eating away at the economy. By 1989, the satellite states in Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary, East Germany, were watching the chaos in Moscow. They saw a Soviet Union that was broke, distracted, and weak. They realized that the Kremlin could no longer afford to send in the tanks to crush a rebellion. An invasion cost money, and Gorbachev didn't have any. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, not because of a military defeat, but because the Soviet Union couldn't afford the rent on its empire anymore. Chernobyl had drained the accounts. The 18 billion ruble fire had burned up the funds needed to maintain the Iron Curtain. As the 1990s dawned, the Soviet Union was a hollow shell. The budget deficit was out of control. The republics were demanding independence, and the ghost of Chernobyl was still there, demanding payment. The liquidators were getting sick. They demanded the health care and pensions they were promised. But the state had no money to pay them. The Chernobyl Union became one of the first independent political organizations in the USSR, organizing protests and strikes. The very men who had saved the country were now suing it for bankruptcy. In the final accounting, Chernobyl was not just a nuclear accident. It was a stress test that the Soviet economic system failed. It revealed that a command economy, rigid and secretive, could not handle a complex modern disaster. It proved that the empire was too poor to be safe. The radiation didn't kill the Soviet Union instantly. It was a slow poisoning. It weakened the immune system of the state, making it vulnerable to the other viruses attacking it: low oil prices, ethnic nationalism, and the desire for freedom. When the red flag finally came down in December 1991, it was the end of a tragedy that had started 5 years earlier in a control room in Ukraine. The bill for the cleanup had finally come due, and the only way to pay it was to liquidate the country itself. The 18 billion ruble fire had consumed the superpower. By 1990, the Soviet Union was no longer facing a singular crisis, but a convergence of catastrophes. The economic structure was buckling under the weight of the oil price collapse, the disastrous war in Afghanistan, and the fiscal hole blown by the anti-alcohol campaign. But radiating through all of these fractures was the ceaseless, expensive half-life of Chernobyl. The disaster had mutated from an acute emergency into a chronic, debilitating illness that the state could not cure. In the early days, the costs were about containment, concrete lead, and sand. But by the turn of the decade, the costs had shifted to something far more expensive and politically volatile: compensation. The Soviet government had made a fatal error in the immediate aftermath of the explosion. To encourage hundreds of thousands of men to run towards the radiation instead of away from it, they had promised them the world. They promised the liquidators higher wages, early retirement priority housing, and free health care for life. They promised the evacuees from Pripyat and the surrounding villages new apartments and cash settlements. It was a mortgage taken out on the future of the Soviet Union. And in 1990, the bill came due. The Soviet parliament passed the Chernobyl laws. These were massive social welfare packages designed to placate the growing anger of the victims. The laws expanded the definition of who was affected. Suddenly, it wasn't just the men on the reactor roof. It was millions of people living in the contaminated zones of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The price tag was astronomical. In Belarus alone, a small republic that took the brunt of the radioactive fallout, the government was spending nearly 20% of its entire annual budget just on Chernobyl-related costs. Think about that. 1 out of every 5 rubles the government spent was going to pay for a disaster that had happened 4 years prior. It left almost nothing for schools, roads, or industrial investment. This created a vicious cycle of poverty. Because the republics like Belarus and Ukraine were spending all their money on radiation payments, they couldn't invest in their factories. Their economies stagnated even faster than the rest of the Union. The people became poorer, and because they were poorer, they demanded more help from the state. Moscow was supposed to fill the gap. The central government was the insurer of last resort. But Moscow was broke. The Kremlin was printing money to pay these benefits because it had no tax revenue. This injection of billions of unbacked rubles into the economy acted like an accelerant on the fire of inflation. The Soviet citizens had pockets full of Chernobyl money, but the shops were empty. The paradox of the shortage economy reached its peak. You could be a millionaire liquidator on paper, but you still had to stand in line for 4 hours to buy a carton of milk that might be contaminated with strontium-90. The financial strain of Chernobyl fundamentally altered the relationship between the republics and the central government. For decades, the Soviet Union held together because the center provided stability. Moscow was the provider. But now Moscow was the poisoner. In Ukraine, the mood turned from sadness to nationalist rage. The Ukrainians looked at the smoking ruins of reactor number 4 and saw a symbol of Russian imperialism. The power plant had been built by orders from Moscow. The electricity it generated was sent to the Soviet grid. But when it blew up, the radioactive ash fell on Ukrainian soil. The Ukrainian independence movement, which had been dormant for decades, was galvanized by the Geiger counter. The first major mass protests in Kiev weren't just about language or culture, they were about eco-nationalism. The people demanded to know why their children were sick. They demanded to know why Moscow was still building nuclear plants. They demanded control over their own environment and, crucially, their own money. They argued that if they stopped sending their tax revenue to Moscow, they could afford to clean up the mess themselves. Chernobyl became the strongest argument for the dissolution of the Union. It was the moment the republics realized that the central government was not just incompetent, but a threat to their biological survival. Meanwhile, the energy crisis deepened. The Soviet Union was the world's largest producer of oil and gas, yet it was suffering from rolling blackouts. The Chernobyl shock had frozen the nuclear industry. Dozens of planned reactors were canceled or suspended. The Soviet energy grid, which had banked on a nuclear future, was suddenly undersupplied. To keep the lights on in factories and apartments, the Soviets had to burn more of their own natural gas and oil, resources that were desperately needed for export to earn hard currency. It was a zero-sum game. Every barrel of oil burned in a Soviet power plant was a barrel of oil that couldn't be sold to the West for dollars. And without dollars, they couldn't buy grain or medicine. The domestic energy consumption ate into the export profits, spiraling the budget deficit even deeper into the red. By late 1990, the financial contagion had infected the banking system. The Soviet Union began to default on its commercial payments to Western suppliers. Ships carrying frozen meat and butter anchored off the coast of Leningrad refused to dock because the captains knew the Soviet checks would bounce. Why were the checks bouncing? Because the treasury had been drained by the emergency spending. The billions spent on the sarcophagus, the billions spent on the new city of Slavutik, the billions spent on medical care, it had all evaporated the cash reserves. The West watched this with alarm. They saw a nuclear-armed superpower descending into economic anarchy. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank sent economists to Moscow to analyze the books. What they found terrified them. They found a state that was functionally insolvent. The Chernobyl line item in the budget was a black hole that no amount of loans could fill. Western leaders faced a dilemma. If they didn't lend money to Gorbachev, the Soviet Union might collapse into chaos, potentially losing control of its nuclear arsenal. But if they did lend money, it would just be incinerated in the furnace of the debt crisis. Gorbachev, humiliated, had to go hat in hand to the G7 summit in London. He begged for a massive loan package, the grand bargain. He asked for $30 billion to stabilize the economy. But the Western leaders balked. They saw that the Soviet economy was a leaking bucket. Why pour $30 billion into a system that was spending 20% of its regional budgets on a nuclear cleanup and the rest on a bloated military? They gave him polite applause, but no cash. Gorbachev returned to Moscow empty-handed. His political authority was shattered. The hardliners in the KGB and the military looked at him and saw a man who had begged the West and failed. They began to plot the coup that would eventually take place in August 1991. But the coup plotters made the same mistake everyone else did. They thought the problem was political leadership. They didn't understand that the problem was accounting. They could arrest Gorbachev. They could put tanks in Red Square, but they couldn't print hard currency. They couldn't make the radiation go away. They couldn't force the soil to be clean. The 18 billion ruble fire had burned away the legitimacy of the Communist Party. The social contract was based on the idea that the party takes care of the people. Chernobyl proved that the party would lie to the people, expose them to death, and then fail to pay for their treatment. As the winter of 1991 approached, the atmosphere in the Soviet Union was apocalyptic. There were rumors of famine. The bread lines stretched for blocks. And in the hospitals of Kiev and Minsk, the children of the Chernobyl zone were filling the wards, a living, dying testament to the bankruptcy of the empire. The system was running on fumes. The gold reserves were gone, sold in secret to pay for food imports that were barely keeping the cities from starvation. The final liquidation of the Soviet Union was fast approaching, and the cost of the cleanup was the lien on the property that no successor state wanted to inherit. The tragedy of the explosion had become the tragedy of the collapse. The coup of August 1991 was the dying gasp of the Soviet system, but it was also the moment when the bill for Chernobyl was finally presented for payment. When the hardliners sent tanks into Moscow, they were trying to seize control of a state that had already been hollowed out by 5 years of financial hemorrhage. They were fighting for the captain's wheel of the Titanic long after the iceberg had struck. The failure of the coup accelerated the inevitable, but the specific mechanism of the breakup was deeply tied to the nuclear disaster. On August 24, 1991, just days after the coup collapsed, the Ukrainian parliament declared independence. This was the fatal blow. The Soviet Union could perhaps survive without the Baltics, but it could not survive without Ukraine, its industrial heartland and its breadbasket. When Ukrainian leaders made their case for leaving the Union, they didn't just talk about freedom or democracy. They talked about survival. They argued that Moscow had turned their land into a radioactive colony. They argued that the central government had proven itself incapable of protecting the biological life of the Ukrainian people. The shadow of the reactor loomed over the vote. The referendum for independence in December 1991 received over 90% support. The people voted to leave the Soviet Union because they believed that staying meant death. On December 25, 1991, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, and the red flag over the Kremlin was lowered. To the West, it looked like a victory for capitalism, but to the accountants in the Ministry of Finance, it was a liquidation. The 15 new nations that emerged from the wreckage inherited the borders and the armies of the old empire, but they also inherited its liabilities. And the biggest liability on the books was the exclusion zone. Russia, as the legal successor state to the USSR, took on the foreign debt, but Ukraine and Belarus were left holding the radioactive bag. They were now independent, but they were also broke. The economic supply chains that linked the Soviet economy collapsed. Factories shut down. Hyperinflation wiped out the savings of every citizen. In this chaos, the victims of Chernobyl were the first to suffer. The Chernobyl laws that had promised generous pensions and health care to the liquidators and evacuees became worthless pieces of paper. The governments simply did not have the money to pay. The liquidators, the men who had shoveled graphite on the roof and dug tunnels under the core, found themselves living in poverty in the new capitalist reality. Their pensions were eaten by inflation. The free health care they were promised vanished as the state hospitals ran out of medicine. They were the heroes of the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union was gone, and the new nations viewed them as a crushing financial burden. Throughout the 1990s, the cost of Chernobyl continued to drag down the economies of the post-Soviet space. In Belarus, the situation was particularly grim. Nearly a quarter of the country's territory was contaminated. The government had to spend huge portions of its budget just monitoring the radiation and providing meager support to the sick. It was a tax on the future that stifled growth for a generation. But the physical legacy of the disaster, the sarcophagus itself, was also failing. The concrete tomb built in haste in 1986 was never meant to be permanent. It was crumbling. Rainwater was leaking in, risking a new chain reaction inside the ruins. The structure was rusting. Experts warned that if the sarcophagus collapsed, it would release another cloud of radioactive dust over Europe. Ukraine didn't have the money to fix it. Russia didn't have the money to fix it. The Soviet economy had been so thoroughly destroyed that the successor states could not even afford to clean up their own mess. They had to go begging. In a final humiliation, the Ukrainian government appealed to the G7 nations for help. They essentially told the West, if you don't pay to fix this, it will be your problem too. The result was the Shelter Implementation Plan. A massive international fund was set up, financed by the United States, the European Union, and dozens of other countries. They spent over $2 billion to build the new safe confinement, that giant steel arch that now sits over the reactor. Think about what that means. The Soviet Union, the superpower that terrified the world, eventually needed a GoFundMe campaign funded by its enemies just to keep its nuclear waste from killing everyone. It was the ultimate proof of the total economic bankruptcy of the Soviet system. They could build the reactor, but they couldn't afford the insurance policy. So was Gorbachev right? Did Chernobyl cause the collapse? Historians often point to the war in Afghanistan or the American Star Wars program as the causes of the Soviet demise. But those were military pressures. The Soviet Union was a military state. It was designed to handle military pressure. It could build tanks even when the people were hungry. Chernobyl was different. It was an asymmetric shock. It hit the economy from a direction it wasn't designed to defend. It destroyed the environment, which destroyed agriculture. It destroyed the oil revenue, which destroyed the budget. It destroyed the lie of competence, which destroyed political legitimacy. The 18 billion ruble cost was the tipping point. The Soviet economy was like a bridge that was already rusting and groaning under the weight of inefficiency. Chernobyl was the heavy truck that drove onto that bridge at the worst possible moment. It snapped the cables. If the reactor hadn't exploded, the Soviet Union might have limped on for another decade. It might have followed the Chinese model of slow economic reform. Gorbachev might have been able to manage a transition, but the disaster stripped him of the time and the capital he needed. It forced him to print money when he should have been tightening the belt. It forced him to focus on survival when he should have been focusing on growth. The legacy of Chernobyl is usually measured in half-lives of radioactive isotopes, but it should also be measured in inflation rates and GDP graphs. It is a lesson in the fragility of complex systems. The Soviet planners thought they could control the atom just as they thought they could control the economy. They were wrong on both counts. In the end, the Soviet Union didn't end with a bang or a whimper. It ended with a default. It ended because the cost of its own arrogance became too high to pay. The most powerful empire in the East was brought down by a safety test that went wrong and a bill that came due. Today, the zone of alienation stands as a silent monument to this collapse. The empty apartment blocks of Pripyat are not just ruins of a city, they are the ruins of an economic system. The rusting Ferris wheel that never turned is a symbol of a future that was promised but never delivered because the money ran out. The 18 billion ruble fire burned through the Iron Curtain and revealed that behind the steel there was nothing but debt. And when the people saw the debt, they realized the empire was already dead. The radiation just made the autopsy easier to read. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.